Reddit. What's your favorite podcast? Escape from Walt Disney host Tony Goldmart reviews movies on Disney. He has a regular group of friends that review with him. There's sometimes a long wait between episodes. Dave and Ethan's 2000 Weird Al podcast. Dave Elvis Rossi and Ethan Ullman hosts a podcast about Weird Al. They have interviewed hundreds of people that have known Al in college, worked with him on records, movies or TV shows. They have interviewed Bill Mumy from Lost in Space and radio legend Dr. Demento, who gave Al his first airplay. They also have interviewed Al and had him guest a few times as their intern Frank. La vida me da says the translation to the English is something like life gives me gastritis, is about a bald man who complains about things like the public transport service, the neighbors, The Simpsons and many other themes like the middle class or the politic. But it is not only empty complaints. There is a lot of humor, good jokes and deep social reflections about our society and the South American world. I really recommend it to you if you speak Spanish and you want to listen to a really good podcast. In general, I recommend you all what his creator Senior Santo makes. Worlds Beyond Number the Wizard, the Witch, and the Wild One. NABPod Not Another DD podcast. Both are Dungeons and Dragons podcasts, and they are wildly different from each other. WBN is inspired by Studio Ghibli and is a slow burn, and NADPod is mostly comedy interspersed with dramatic moments at bigger plot points. Edit also Blowback. It's in its 4th season. S1 is about the Iraq War, S to Cuba, S3 Korean War, and S for Afghanistan. It's about the foreign policy leading up to and subsequent blowback of these major conflicts. Reply All now defunct, but they did great investigations mostly centered around internet mysteries. Case of the Missing Hit is an all-time episode. The Dollop One guy who knows history pretty well explains stories to a guy that doesn't know it at all. Ronald Reagan with Patton is my favorite episode. Not Another DD podcast is slightly sillier than average D&D pod. The Mavericks Chronicles is a short side quest that is basically the hangover on spring break with fantasy frat brothers. The Dead Authors podcast. Been dead for like 10 years, but it's the funniest one I've ever heard. Paul F. He uses to go through history and find famous dead authors played by a rotating cast of the best stand-up comics in the world in a semi-improvisational, but actually pretty deeply researched interview. Nicobit's podcast division ran by some Twitch streamer named Kaziva, and their stuff in like Spotify's on YouTube for sure. I like it just cause I can zone out and they just go on wild tangents for some people. I think the most frequent guest is their video editor. I was listening to one and they were talking Star Wars and then went on a 2-hour tangent about high school. All fantasy everything has been my go-to lately. Just a group of funny people and guests drafting fantasy lists of pop culture. Topics have included fictional horse names, places to pee that aren't a toilet, buff dudes, and movie props you wish you owned. Those are all relatively recent ones. The regular hosts work off of each other and riff really well, and the guests are almost always great. Brain Ladle Trivia, funniest trivia podcast out there. It gets better with age as you catch on to all the running gags the show has accumulated. Lateral thinking questions, such as on September 26, 2023, the game between the Minnesota Vikings and Tampa Bay Buccaneers was celebrated by thousands of fans, none of which had a rooting interest in that game. Why? Bad movies rule. Group of friends get together and go through bad movies, and at the end, give out awards. For example, the Steven Seagal Trash Can Full of Dirt award for the performance so bad that replacing it with a trash can full of dirt would have made the movie better. Good guys and girls with a good show. Check it out. Ty and that guy. Though I watch the episodes on YouTube. Ty Frank, co-writer of the Expanse series, and Wes Chatham, actor Amos. They started out just discussing Expanse episodes, but now examine films generally. Dr. Game Show. It's just two comedians struggling to play word games for an hour with callers over Zoom. Extremely hilarious and fun. My wife and I were lucky enough to be contestants last year. It was a blast. Dr. Game Show, absolutely delightful show about adults and sometimes kids playing silly games. Would recommend anyone that just needs some feel-good podcast listening. I'm hooked to the scene and the unseen by Amit Verma, an Indian podcast which talks about politics, economics, behavioral sciences, etc. Do check it out. The Adventure Zone, it's a D&D podcast by the McElroy brothers and father. Sure, there's been some good and bad seasons, but overall I do enjoy it. 1. Freakonomics Radio. The Esser Klein Show. You are not so smart. 99 Invisible. Throughline. Stuff you should know. The Unbiased Science Podcast. The Magnus Archives Horror Podcast. Complete with 200 episodes. Its sequel is airing now. Incredible writing and voice acting. Mum Can't Cook, they summarize and joke about the Disney Channel original movies that make up a core part of my childhood. The Always Sunny Podcast. If only it would come back. Die to the writer's strike. R.I.P. Wade Boggs and the Sunny Pod. Counter Clark. Darn Town. To be fair, I could listen to Carl McLachlan read the phone book. New Heights. Gaza Podcast. It's a metal podcast hosted by the guitarist of the deathcore band Suicide Silence. Darknet Diaries. If cybersecurity or tech in general interests you, please give this a listen. Dan Collins' Hardcore History. All other podcasts look at this works you mighty and despair. Surprised to not find How Did This Get Made on here? A comedy podcast about bad movies. Sweet Bows by Garrett Watts and Andrew Sawitsky. Very funny, engaging and entertaining. Talo Transmito Osinomas. Sadly, it's been dead for a few years, but never forgotten. Wiser World. This podcast will kill you. Real survival stories. Preconceived. And that's why we drink. Small Town Murder. If you're into spooky true crime. Last Podcast on the Left. It's legit one of my favorite things on the planet. Making Sense, Sam Harris. Most informative, best guests, best interviewer. Everything Puzzle in a Thunderstorm does. Scathing, Gam. Skepticrats et al. Storytime with Dutch Mantel. The Drive-Through. The Jim Cornette Experience. Fuckface. It's the only time Gavin Free is the normal guy in a group. History That Doesn't Suck is a really good one I've been into lately. Behind the Bastards. Knowledge Fight. Some More News. Critical Role. Avatar Braving the Elements. How Rude Tanneritos. Pod Meets World. Big Feats. A watch-along podcast for the show Mountain Monsters. Conan O'Brien Needs a Friend. True Sunlight. The Office Ladies. Plumbing the Death Star and other Sanspants radio podcasts. Crime Junkies. Small Town Murder. True Crime Garage. Smith and Sniff. All we have ways of making you talk.